Jonathan Hayes stood in his corner office, gazing out at the glittering skyline of New York City. At 46, he had everything a man could want, or at least, that's what people told him. He owned Hayes Global Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar company, and had his name listed among the most powerful business magnates in the country. His time was measured in high-stakes deals, board meetings, and transatlantic flights. Success had been his only goal, and he had achieved it. But tonight, as he adjusted his cufflinks and grabbed his tailored coat, something felt off. His assistant, Martha Evans, a woman who had worked with him for 2 decades, knocked lightly on the door. "Your dinner reservation at La Belle Bistro is in an hour, Mr. Hayes. The investors from London will be there." Jonathan sighed, forcing a polite nod. Another dinner filled with business talk, empty laughter, and handshakes over expensive wine. "Thank you, Martha. You should head home," he said. She hesitated for a moment before placing a letter on his desk. "One more thing, sir. This arrived today. It's from Carter and Associates." Jonathan's body stiffened. Carter. It had been years since he'd heard that name. His hands hovered over the envelope. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Eliana Carter, his ex-wife. The only woman he had ever truly loved. Shaking off the memories, he slipped the envelope into his desk drawer. "Not tonight," he muttered to himself. The past had no place in his present. The restaurant was the epitome of elegance. Soft jazz played in the background, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow, and tuxedoed waiters moved gracefully between tables. Jonathan sat at the head of the private dining room, sipping a glass of California Cabernet Sauvignon, half listening to one of the investors drone on about European market expansions. And then he saw her. 3 tables away, Eliana Carter sat, poised and radiant, as if time had barely touched her. Her dark curls framed her face, and she still had that graceful confidence he once adored. But it wasn't just her presence that made his heart pound. It was the 3 children sitting with her. 2 girls and a boy, all around 5 years old. They had her warm smile, but something else caught Jonathan's attention, the way the boy's piercing blue eyes mirrored his own. One of the girls tilted her head to the side, an exact gesture Eliana used to make when she was deep in thought. His world tilted. Jonathan did a quick calculation in his mind. 5 years old. Eliana had left him 6 years ago. His breath hitched. Could they be? His hands tightened around the stem of his wine glass. His usual sharp wit and control vanished. Across the table, one of the investors chuckled. "Jonathan, you okay?" Without answering, he pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his drink. "I need some air," he muttered, his heart hammering in his chest. But instead of heading toward the exit, his feet carried him straight toward Eliana's table. She looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The children giggled at something, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling around them. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice raw. "Eliana." One of the little girls tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, who's that?" Eliana's gaze never wavered from Jonathan's. Her lips parted slightly before she finally answered. "Someone Mommy used to know." Jonathan felt the world shift beneath his feet. These were his children. And he had never even known they existed. Jonathan Hayes had always prided himself on being a man of control. He built his empire on precision, strategy, and the ability to stay 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But tonight, as he sat in the back seat of his black Lincoln Navigator, staring blankly out at the city lights, he felt anything but in control. His mind replayed the scene at the restaurant over and over. Eliana. The 3 children. The way the little boy's blue eyes had mirrored his own. The way one of the girls had tilted her head, just like Eliana used to do. 5 years old. It was impossible to ignore the math. By the time his driver pulled up to his Manhattan penthouse, Jonathan's pulse was hammering. He strode inside, tossing his coat on the sleek leather chair in the foyer, and headed straight for his office. The letter from Carter and Associates was still sitting where he had left it, untouched. With a deep breath, he tore it open. Jonathan. I debated whether to send this for a long time. You made it clear years ago where your priorities were. I tried reaching out before, but you never responded. I don't know if you ever received my messages or if you simply chose to ignore them. Either way, this is the last time I will attempt to contact you. You don't owe me anything, but you do owe them the truth. Eliana. There was no further explanation. No accusations. No bitterness. Just a quiet, heartbreaking finality. Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. Had she tried to tell him? He needed answers. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at his office before dawn. His longtime assistant, Martha Evans, was already there, as she always was, early, efficient, and unfailingly loyal. She looked up from her desk, surprised to see him so soon. "Good morning, sir." "Martha," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Did Eliana ever try to contact me after she left?" Martha's expression shifted, something flickering behind her usual composed demeanor. "Sir? Don't play dumb. 5 years ago, did she call? Right? Anything?" Martha hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Several times." Jonathan felt the ground tilt beneath him. "And what happened to those messages?" A flicker of regret crossed her face. "At the time, your assistant was Daniel Reynolds. He handled all your personal correspondence." Jonathan clenched his jaw. Daniel Reynolds. A man who had been ruthless in keeping distractions away from him. "Where is Reynolds now?" Martha exhaled. "He left the company 4 years ago. But before he did, I overheard him tell someone that he had taken care of your ex-wife's attempts to reach you." Jonathan's stomach turned to stone. He sank into his leather chair, running a hand through his hair. "I never got those messages," he murmured, half to himself. "No, sir," Martha confirmed softly. "You didn't." Jonathan sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what had been stolen from him, not money, not power, but something far more valuable. Time. 5 years. 5 years of birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and first words. 5 years where he could have been a father. And all because one man had decided that his family wasn't worth the distraction. Rage burned through him like wildfire. But underneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something else, guilt. Because deep down, Jonathan knew that even if the messages had gotten through, there had been a time when he might have ignored them. He had spent years convincing himself that work came first. That love was secondary. That Eliana had left because she couldn't keep up with his world. Now, he saw the truth. He had pushed her away. But no more. Jonathan stood abruptly. "Find me everything," he told Martha. "Any record of her calls, letters, emails, whatever you can dig up." She nodded. "Of course, sir." "And Jonathan." He looked up. "I know you. You're not the man you were 5 years ago. You're not too late." He wasn't sure if that was true. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to waste another second. Jonathan Hayes had spent his life negotiating billion-dollar deals, making impossible decisions under pressure, and commanding the respect of CEOs across the world. But as he stood outside Eliana Carter's modest home on a quiet suburban street, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: fear. He wasn't here to close a business deal or salvage a failing merger. He was here to win back something money couldn't buy: the trust of his children and the woman who had raised them alone. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A moment later, Eliana opened it, her expression unreadable. She had always been impossible to intimidate, a quality he had once admired but now found daunting. "You came," she said, arms crossed. "You gave me a chance," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. "I'm not wasting it." The living room was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold, high-rise penthouse Jonathan called home. Framed drawings covered the walls, a mixture of crayon, watercolor, and colored pencil. A small bookshelf overflowed with science books, sketch pads, and soccer trophies. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. These weren't just any children's things. These were his children's things. 3 pairs of eyes watched him cautiously from the couch: Sienna, Isla, and Leo. Eliana knelt down beside them. "Kids, this is Mr. Hayes," she said carefully. "Remember him from the restaurant?" Leo frowned. "The man who made Mommy nervous?" Eliana coughed, clearly unprepared for that observation. Jonathan forced a smile. I didn't mean to. I was just surprised. The truth is, I was really happy to see you." Sienna, the eldest by 2 minutes, tilted her head, a gesture that made Jonathan's chest tighten. "Mommy said you're our dad." He nodded, crouching down to their level. "Yes, I am." Isla's small fingers toyed with the hem of her dress. "Where were you?" The question hit him like a freight train. Where had he been? In boardrooms? On planes? At investor meetings? He took a steadying breath. "I was lost," he admitted. "I thought work was the most important thing. I didn't know about you. But if I had, I swear, I would have been here." The children exchanged glances. They weren't convinced, but they weren't running away either. That was something. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan did what he did best: he learned. But instead of stock markets and financial forecasts, he studied his children. He learned that Sienna loved to paint and spent hours sketching animals and landscapes. He learned that Isla adored science and wanted to be an astronaut, memorizing the names of planets before she could spell them. He learned that Leo was fiercely competitive in soccer and could already dribble like a pro. So, Jonathan adapted. He sent high-quality art supplies to Sienna's school anonymously. He donated books to Isla's class about space exploration. He funded new soccer equipment for Leo's team. Eliana, of course, saw through it immediately. "If you think you can buy their love, Jonathan, you're wrong," she said one evening after their weekly coffee meeting. He sighed. "I don't want to buy anything. I don't know how else to show them I care." She studied him for a long moment before saying, "Then show up. Keep showing up." One afternoon, Jonathan received an unexpected text from Eliana. "Leo's soccer game. Saturday. 3 p.m. If you're serious about being their father, be there." It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. That Saturday, Jonathan arrived at the field 10 minutes early. Dressed in jeans and a polo shirt, his first attempt at casual in years, he stood at the sidelines, feeling completely out of place among the minivans and folding chairs. Then, he saw Leo. The boy was scanning the crowd, searching, until his eyes landed on Jonathan. For a moment, he just stared. Then, cautiously, he gave the smallest nod before jogging back onto the field. Jonathan exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Jonathan Hayes had always believed that business challenges were the toughest battles he would ever face. But as he rushed through the sterile white halls of St. Mary's Hospital, his heart pounding, he realized how wrong he had been. Nothing, not corporate takeovers, not billion-dollar negotiations, not even his most ruthless competitors, compared to the fear gripping him now. His daughter, Sienna, was somewhere beyond those emergency room doors, struggling to breathe. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan felt completely powerless. The call had come late that evening. Jonathan had just finished a long board meeting when his phone buzzed with a message from Eliana. "It's Sienna. Her asthma. We're at St. Mary's." He hadn't hesitated. He had run, ignoring traffic lights, ignoring the emails flooding his phone, ignoring everything except the thought of his little girl struggling for air. Now, standing beside Eliana in the hospital waiting room, he forced himself to breathe. What happened? His voice was hoarse. Eliana's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands gripping a paper coffee cup. She had an attack in the middle of the night. Worse than before. Her inhaler wasn't enough. Jonathan felt a surge of guilt. He hadn't even known she had asthma. "Where is she now?" he asked, his throat tightening. "They took her back for oxygen therapy." Eliana's voice cracked. She was so scared, Jonathan. He reached for her hand instinctively, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. "We should have been doing this together," he murmured. She didn't answer, but she didn't let go either. As they waited, Jonathan's mother, Margaret Hayes, arrived, her heels clicking against the tile floor, her presence as imposing as ever. "This is unacceptable," she declared. "That child should have the best private doctors, not be here in some overrun public hospital." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "She's getting good care, Mother." Margaret barely looked at him before turning to Eliana. "This is exactly why we need to take custody. You've kept these children from their rightful family long enough." Eliana's face paled, but she stood her ground. "You have no right to." Margaret cut her off. "Jonathan, think. You have the resources to give them the best life possible. If you won't take action, I will." Something inside Jonathan snapped. "No," he said, his voice cold. "There will be no lawsuits. No threats. No fights." He stepped between his mother and Eliana. "These are my children. Our children. And I won't let you use them as leverage." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "So, you choose them over your legacy?" Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I choose them. Every time." For the first time in his life, he saw something unfamiliar in his mother's expression: defeat. A doctor finally emerged. "She's stable," he said. "But her asthma is serious. She'll need regular treatment, lifestyle adjustments, and a structured plan to manage it." Jonathan nodded, his voice steady. "Whatever she needs. I'll make sure she has it." As he stepped into Sienna's hospital room, watching her tiny frame resting peacefully, he made a silent vow. He had failed them before. He wouldn't fail them again. Jonathan Hayes had spent his life making promises to investors, to clients, to his board of directors. But those promises had always been tied to numbers, profits, and bottom lines. Now, for the first time, he was making promises that truly mattered. To his children. It had been 3 weeks since Sienna's hospitalization, and in that time, Jonathan had done something he had never done before. He showed up. Not just once, not just when it was convenient, but every single day. At first, the children were wary. Sienna, still recovering from her asthma attack, would sit quietly while she drew, sneaking occasional glances at him but never saying much. Isla, the most curious of the three, asked questions like, "Do you really own a whole company? And do you ever wear normal clothes?" Leo, on the other hand, was the toughest. He would eye Jonathan from across the room, arms crossed, his little jaw set in a way that made Jonathan's heart ache. "Mom says people should prove they mean what they say," Leo said one day, kicking a soccer ball against the fence. "Not just talk about it." Jonathan nodded, crouching down beside him. "She's right. I need to prove it to you." Leo kicked the ball harder. "How?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "How about you tell me? What would prove it to you?" The boy hesitated. Then, with a challenging look, he said, "Come to my soccer game." Jonathan didn't just show up, he came early. The game was at a community park, a world away from the exclusive country clubs Jonathan was used to. Parents sat in foldable camping chairs, drinking coffee from thermoses. The field was patchy in spots, the goalposts a little crooked. And yet, as Jonathan took a seat next to Eliana, watching Leo run onto the field, he realized this was more important than any boardroom he had ever been in. Leo spotted him in the crowd. Their eyes met. Jonathan didn't wave, didn't call out, he just nodded, silently telling his son, "I see you. I'm here." At halftime, Leo jogged over, sweat dripping from his brow. He looked up at Jonathan, then at his mom, then back at Jonathan again. "You actually came," he said, his voice laced with surprise. Jonathan smiled. "I told you I would." Leo studied him for a long moment. Then, in a move that nearly shattered Jonathan's heart, he held out his soccer ball. "You want to pass it with me?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "I'd love to." As he kicked the ball back and forth with his son, laughter bubbling up between them, Jonathan knew this was what rebuilding trust looked like. Not grand gestures. Not empty words. Just showing up, over and over again, until the walls finally came down. Jonathan Hayes had spent years believing that success meant power, wealth, and control. His name was etched onto skyscrapers, whispered in elite circles, and printed in financial magazines. But none of it mattered now. Not when he had spent 6 years missing bedtime stories, scraped knees, and first words. Not when his children still hesitated before calling him dad. Something had to change. Jonathan's penthouse in Manhattan was a symbol of everything he had built, a sleek, glass-walled fortress with 1,200 thread-count sheets, an infinity pool, and a view that stretched for miles. But it wasn't a home. Not for his children. So, he made a decision. "I need to find a house," he told his assistant, Martha, one morning. "Not in the city. Somewhere close to Eliana and the kids." She nearly dropped her coffee. "A house? You?" Jonathan simply nodded. For the first time in his life, he was thinking beyond himself. 2 weeks later, Jonathan stood in the backyard of a 5-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood, just 10 minutes from Eliana's house. It had a big oak tree perfect for climbing, a porch swing, and a yard large enough for a soccer goal. It wasn't the kind of place he ever imagined himself living. But as he looked around, picturing Sienna painting on the porch, Isla reading under the tree, and Leo practicing his penalty kicks, he realized this was home. He signed the papers that afternoon. The next challenge was his career. For decades, Jonathan had been at the helm of Hayes Global Enterprises, personally overseeing every major decision. His schedule was a relentless cycle of board meetings, investor calls, and international travel. But now, something was more important. That evening, he drafted an email to the board. Effective immediately, I am stepping back from daily operations. My family needs me. I trust the team we've built to carry us forward. He hesitated for a moment, then hit send. Martha walked in just as he closed his laptop. You really did it, she said softly. Jonathan exhaled. Yeah, I did. She smiled. The old you wouldn't have. He chuckled. The old me had no idea what he was missing. When Jonathan told Eliana about his decision, she didn't hide her surprise. You're really doing this? I am, he said firmly. Because I don't just want to be the father on their birth certificates, I want to be their dad. That weekend, he picked up his kids for the first overnight stay at his new house. As they ran through the empty halls, choosing bedrooms, jumping on the couch, and racing to the backyard, Jonathan knew he had finally built something worth more than all the money in the world. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hayes wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't standing in a boardroom delivering a presentation or shaking hands with high-profile investors. Tonight, he was standing in a crowded elementary school auditorium, surrounded by parents juggling camcorders, balloons, and congratulatory flowers. And all his attention was focused on one tiny spot on the stage, his daughter, Sienna. Jonathan had never attended a school play before. The last time he had sat in an audience like this, it had been for a corporate event at a five-star gala. This was different. The stage curtains opened, and there she was, Sienna, dressed in a tiny pink pig costume, standing proudly among her classmates in a production of The Three Little Pigs. From his seat in the third row, Jonathan could see how nervous she was. She twisted the hem of her costume, scanning the crowd with wide eyes. Then, she saw him. Jonathan held his breath, wondering if she would look away. Instead, she smiled. A small, shy smile, but a smile nonetheless. And in that moment, he knew every sacrifice had been worth it. A week later, Jonathan found himself in a very different setting, his backyard, covered in streamers, balloons, and the joyful chaos of a 6th birthday party. Not just any birthday party, his children's first birthday with him there. Instead of the high-end catering he was used to, there was a homemade cake with slightly uneven frosting, courtesy of Eliana and the kids. Instead of classical music, there was laughter, screaming, and kids chasing each other with bubble wands. Jonathan had once closed a $200 million deal in under an hour. But blowing up balloons with Leo, helping Isla glue stars onto her birthday crown, and watching Sienna unwrap a brand new art set felt like a much greater accomplishment. Make a wish, Eliana encouraged the kids as they prepared to blow out their candles. Sienna thought for a moment, then shrugged. I don't need to. I already got what I wanted. Jonathan's throat tightened. Was it possible for your heart to break and heal at the same time? At the end of the party, Eliana handed each child an envelope. Inside were official name change documents, allowing them to legally carry both last names, Carter Hayes. Jonathan's eyes stung as he looked at Eliana. This way, she said softly, they'll always know they belong to both of us. Leo tugged at Jonathan's sleeve. Does this mean we're, like, official now? Jonathan knelt, his voice thick with emotion. Leo, he said, pulling his son into a hug, we were official from the start. But now, the whole world will know it, too. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hayes had everything that truly mattered. For most of his life, Jonathan Hayes measured success in numbers, profit margins, quarterly earnings, and the number of boardrooms where his name commanded attention. But now, success looked entirely different. It looked like a telescope on his back porch, where Isla excitedly pointed out constellations. It looked like muddy soccer cleats left by the front door, proof that Leo had practiced penalty kicks in the yard. It looked like Sienna's newest painting, proudly displayed on the fridge instead of in an art gallery. Jonathan Hayes had spent decades building an empire, only to realize that his greatest fortune was right here, in the form of 3 little hands reaching for his own. A year ago, he had lived in a sleek, minimalist penthouse where silence was constant, interrupted only by the hum of business calls. Now, his house was filled with noise, chaos, and love. One afternoon, he walked into the kitchen to find flour everywhere, on the counters, the floor, even in Isla's hair. Sienna was attempting to crack an egg into a bowl, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Leo was eating chocolate chips straight from the bag. Eliana stood by, shaking her head with amusement. "You know," she said, smirking at Jonathan, "the old you would have had a heart attack over this mess." Jonathan just laughed, grabbing a dish towel to clean up a spilled cup of milk. The old me didn't know what he was missing. Some changes had been easier than others. Walking away from the CEO position at Hayes Global Enterprises had been one of the hardest. The board had called him crazy. His old colleagues had warned him he'd regret it. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped into a part-time advisory role, giving him the freedom to put his family first. His calendar, once filled with investor meetings, was now marked with more important events: Leo's soccer games, Sienna's art showcases, and Isla's science fair. One evening, as Jonathan tucked the kids into bed, Isla asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Daddy," she said, peering up at him, "what do you do now?" He thought about it for a moment. "Well," he said, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders, "I used to think success was about making money. But now, I think success is about being there for the people who matter most." Isla yawned, nodding sleepily. "I like that kind of success." Jonathan smiled, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Me too." As he stepped out of their room, he realized he had never felt more fulfilled. Because real success wasn't about what you built, it was about who you built it for. As we grow older, life grants us the wisdom to look back and see what truly mattered, not the titles we held, the wealth we accumulated, or the accolades we received, but rather the love we shared and the relationships we nurtured. Jonathan Hayes' story is a powerful reminder that success, as defined by society, is not always the success that brings fulfillment. For decades, he built his empire, convinced that financial achievements and professional status were the ultimate measure of his worth. But in doing so, he lost what was most valuable, his connection to his family. It wasn't until he saw his children, nearly strangers to him, that he understood he had been rich in business but bankrupt in love. How often do we prioritize work, responsibilities, or even pride over the people who matter most? Perhaps, like Jonathan, some of us have experienced missed birthdays, forgotten anniversaries, or distant relationships because we were too focused on what we thought was important at the time. But as we reach a certain age, we realize that the moments we missed can't be bought back, and time is the one currency we can never replenish. Yet, Jonathan's story also teaches us that it is never too late to make things right. Even after years of absence, he chose to show up. He chose to change. And he chose to put his family first. For those of us who carry regrets, be it a strained relationship with a child, a friendship that faded, or words left unspoken, this is an invitation to act. A simple phone call, a heartfelt letter, or a quiet moment of forgiveness can bridge the years of distance. Rebuilding relationships doesn't require grand gestures, just consistency, patience, and an open heart. Another profound lesson from Jonathan's journey is that true wealth lies not in possessions but in presence. His mansion meant nothing when compared to a backyard filled with laughter. His billion-dollar deals were insignificant next to a school play where his daughter finally saw him in the audience. These moments, so ordinary yet so precious, remind us that joy is found in connection, not in career milestones. For those of us in our later years, perhaps now is the time to reflect on what we are leaving behind. Are we ensuring that our loved ones feel valued? Are we creating memories that will be cherished long after we are gone? Are we showing up for the people who matter, not just in grand gestures but in the everyday moments that build a life well lived? Jonathan's story is not just a tale of one man's redemption, it is a universal truth. Our true legacy is the love we give and the lives we touch. Because in the end, success is not measured by what we build for ourselves, but by what we build for others.